So I want to welcome everyone this evening. We are so glad that you could join us for this program. And we are grateful to Reverend Greg Jones, Senior Pastor of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, for sharing his perspective on the Israeli-Hamas war and the history leading up to this tragedy. Dr. Jones has spent many years nurturing relationships with Jewish, Muslim, and Christian colleagues and has led pilgrimages to the Holy Land. We look forward to Greg offering this evening's program. As we begin, it is important to note that there is a wide range of opinions and emotions associated with the current events in the Middle East. During our program this evening, we will strive to listen attentively for understanding and treat one another with respect and grace. Following Greg's remarks, there will be an opportunity for questions, answers, discussion. At that time, anyone who wishes to participate, I'll ask that you use the raise hand button on your computer. Or if it doesn't work or you can't find it, you can also actually raise your hand. As I said, this evening's program is being recorded for subsequent viewing by people unable to attend this evening or those who wish to revisit the event. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Reverend Dr. Gregory Knox Jones.
Thank you very much, Sue. I've been asked, as Sue said, to give you my perspective on the current situation. Just a reminder, I'm not a historian, I'm not a politician, I'm a pastor, and I'm deeply concerned about human rights, and that's because I believe all people are children of God. For hundreds of years, anti-Semitism was present in Christian Europe. Regrettably, many Christians blamed Jews for the death of Jesus. At the time of the Protestant Reformation in the early 1500s, such prominent theologians as Martin Luther made horribly anti-Semitic remarks. In the late 19th century, anti-Semitism gave birth to political Zionism. Zionism expressed the powerful drive of the Jewish people to establish themselves as a nation among nations with a land of their own in which they could achieve self-determination. Now, as we know, Adolf Hitler blamed Jews for many of Germany's problems, and he used it as an excuse to try to wipe them out. During the Holocaust, the Nazis killed 12 million people, including 6 million Jews. At the end of World War II, in many ways, because of the guilt over the Holocaust, and so many nations had turned Jews away, the United Nations determined that Jews would be allowed to go to Palestine to create a safe place. Unfortunately, they didn't pay any heed to the fact that there were Palestinians who had been living there for centuries. As soon as the Jews came from Europe and other places from which they'd fled, war broke out. 750,000 Palestinians were forced to flee from their homes and were made refugees. Some fled to Lebanon, some went to Jordan. Many landed in refugee camps, which now are not tent dwellings, but are concrete slums. This is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Camilla and I, as well as some of the Westminster members, have visited refugee camps in Jericho and in Bethlehem. They are overcrowded, poverty-stricken slums. Hard to believe that people have to live their lives that way. The Israeli victory in the 1967 war, in which Israel conquered Sinai, the West Bank, and Syria's Golan Heights, created a sense of euphoria in Israel and throughout the Jewish world. Desiring to drive the Palestinians out of the land has driven the activity to settle the occupied territories with Jewish Israelis. taking land from Palestinians and then building Jewish settlements. And that's just continued until this day. It keeps going despite the fact that it's in violation of international law. If you've ever been to the West Bank, you have seen hundreds of settlements. Camilla and I have led 3 pilgrimages of Westminster members to Israel, Palestine. Our first was back in 2009. We were so naive that many of us in our group went over with the view that the Israelis had created this amazing country and all of the Palestinians were just a negative force. Our eyes were really opened as we began to meet several Palestinians, get to know them as people, talk to them, sit and have tea with them or dinner with them, and then see how the Palestinians are treated. As we returned a few months later in 2010, Reverend Bob Stoddard and we began teaching classes at Westminster on the situation in Israel, Palestine. We invited a Jewish Holocaust survivor to speak to the class. She was in her 90s, but very articulate. We also showed films, and in the years that followed, we brought in different speakers, brought in speakers from churches for Middle East peace, and then we started bringing in speakers who are actually from Israel, Palestine, some Palestinian speakers, among them the Reverend Mitri Rahib. Some of you know that name. We felt it was important for Christians to understand what was happening in the birthplace of Christ and the birthplace of Christianity. It was also important for people to understand who the Palestinians are. Many in the U.S. had equated Palestinians with terrorists. A number of our members were surprised to learn that it's the Christians in the land who are Palestinians. There are Christian Palestinians, Muslim Palestinians, and then many secular Palestinians as well. I have no adequate words for the horrific violence in Israel and Gaza that's been unfolding since October 7th. As we know, Hamas terrorists killed 1,400 people in Israel, including women and children, and took more than 200 hostages. They did despicable things. It was evil and barbaric. Israel has responded with indiscriminate bombing in Gaza. Up to date, more than 9,000 citizens have been killed, almost 4,000 children. That too, in my mind, is evil and barbaric. The suffering and rage of the Jewish and Palestinian communities is bound to be unimaginable at this point. There's so many lives lost, so many children killed, so many people of all ages who've been scarred for life. No words can mend the pain that people are experiencing. I'm appalled that Hamas shot rockets at Israel, attacked from the sea and land. I abhor the killing and maiming of innocent Israeli citizens. I also condemn the Israeli military for repeatedly firing missiles and white phosphorus artillery shells into Gaza that are killing and injuring so many Palestinian civilians, the majority of whom are Christians and Muslims who have nothing to do with the militants. Now, none of this comes as a surprise, unfortunately, to any of us who've been following the developments in Israel-Palestine the last few years. Many people predicted that it was only a matter of time before something like this would happen. There have been other attacks. Some of you remember Operation Cast Lead and Operation Protective Edge. This isn't something new or something that people weren't predicting. Cutting off water, electricity, food, and medicine is not the answer. I sincerely believe that oppression breeds retaliation. A never-ending cycle of revenge will ensure that justice and peace never become a reality. I believe that killing civilians in Gaza is probably going to create more terrorists than it kills. Robert Pape is a professor of political science and director of the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats. And he said recently in an op-ed that Israel is likely producing more terrorists than it's killing. The current generation of terrorists can be killed only to be replaced by a new, larger generation in the future. This is why Israel and the United States have waged major military operations that killed large numbers of existing terrorists in the near term, but ultimately led to the rise of many more terrorists. We can just think about the debacle we had in Afghanistan. This pattern happened in the past when Israel invaded southern Lebanon with 78,000 combat troops and 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles back in 1982. The goal was to smash the PLO terrorists, and Israel achieved significant near-term success. However, that military operation also caused the creation of Hezbollah in July of 1982. It led to vast local support for Hezbollah and waves of suicide attacks. After 3 years, it finally led to the withdrawal of the Israeli army from southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah has been growing ever since. The pattern happened again when Israel maintained a heavy military occupation of Gaza and the West Bank from the early 1990s to 2005. These operations succeeded in killing many terrorists from Hamas and other Palestinian groups, but also triggered vast local support for terrorist groups and suicide attacks against Israelis that did not stop until Israeli military forces finally pulled out. And far from being defeated, Hamas won the 2006 Palestinian elections. The pattern happened again when Israel launched a ground offensive into Lebanon in July of 2006. The goal was to completely destroy Hezbollah leaders and fighters so that it could never kidnap Israeli soldiers and launch missiles at Israeli cities. The Israeli offensive failed, and Hezbollah is stronger today as a result. You may have seen an op-ed by a young man who's in the Israeli military reserves and has been called up. He's a major in the reserves of the Israeli Defense Forces. He recently wrote, as he was on his way actually to reporting for duty in Israel, he said, "This war could have been avoided and no one did enough to prevent it. Israel did not do enough to make peace. We just conquered the Palestinian territories in the West Bank, expanded the illegal settlements, and imposed a long-term siege on the Gaza Strip." I, for one, am really appalled by American politicians who are using this moment to declare that all Palestinians are militants, either displaying her ignorance or knowingly spreading a lie. One congresswoman tweeted to everyone, "Anyone that is pro-Palestinian is pro-Hamas." Of course, many Palestinians cannot stand Hamas. You probably know that Senator Lindsey Graham called on the Israeli Defense Forces to commit war crimes. Referring to the attack on Gaza, he said, "Level the place." That sounds like a call for genocide. At the least, it's encouraging collective punishment, which is a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. The Reverend Bob Stoddard is on this call with us tonight, and I've asked Bob to share a little bit about collective punishment, because he and I have done a fair amount of work on that in the Presbyterian Church and for the Presbyterian General Assembly. So Bob, could you share a little bit right now? You're muted. Most likely bottom left-hand corner.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Great.
Okay. I'd like to tell you all how Westminster's Gaza Overture became the official position of the PCUSA regarding the recent Hamas attacks on Israel and Israel's attacks on Gaza. An overture calling for an end to the siege of Gaza and collective punishment of innocent Palestinian and Israeli citizens was first introduced at the 223rd General Assembly in St. Louis in 2018, but the Assembly failed to approve it. At the PCUSA Israel-Palestine Mission Network meeting in Baltimore in 2019, Marion Bain and I attended, and at the end of the meeting, the network voted to resubmit the Gaza Overture to the next GA, scheduled for June 2020 in Baltimore. Because time was short for getting the necessary lower judicatory approvals beforehand, Mary and I offered to try and fast-track the process and get it before the Newcastle Presbytery meeting in January 2020. After updating the previous overture draft, we quickly got it approved by Westminster's Syria, Lebanon, Palestine Task Force, then by the Church in the World Committee, and then unanimously approved by the session in December to be sent up to the Presbytery for approval. What then were the contents of Westminster's overture? First, it defined collective punishment as a form of retaliation whereby if a person commits a crime, that person's family members, friends, acquaintances, sect, neighbors, or entire ethnic group are targeted for retaliation. The punished group may often have no direct association with the person who perpetrated the crime or direct control over their action. The overture cited Article 3 of the 1949 Geneva Convention that states that communities and nation states are prohibited from taking actions where persons may be punished for an offense he or she has not personally committed. Collective penalties and likewise all measures of intimidation or of terrorism are prohibited. Reprisals against persons and their property are prohibited. This includes actions against civilians or property in reprisal for actions taken by their government over which they have no control. Then the text gave examples of collective punishment, many of which Greg has already cited, taken by both Israel and Hamas up to that point. What actions did the overture call for? The overture calls for the United States government, first, to exhort, that is, urge in the strongest possible terms, the government of Israel to cease and desist all hostile actions that are defined as collective punishment under international law, and end the siege of Gaza that restricts its access to adequate water and electricity and the entrance of food, medicine, and fuel to Palestinians in Gaza. Second, the overture calls on the United States government to exhort, that is, urge in the strongest possible terms, the Hamas government of Gaza and all Palestinian militias within Gaza, such as ISIS, to cease and desist all possible activities against Israel and its citizens that are defined as collective punishment. Now, back to how we did it. We pick up this story with Presbytery Stated Clerk Bob Schmake putting the overture, excuse me, let me just scroll down some more. Putting the overture on the January docket and my drafting statements for Greg to move its approval to be sent to GA and for Andy Jacob of Hanover to second it. The overture was then unanimously approved at the January Presbytery meeting. It was given a second reading at the March meeting when I moved its final approval. Again, approval was unanimous. We had therefore made the deadline for the consideration of the overture at the Baltimore Assembly. Meanwhile, the Mission Network had gotten 7 other presbyteries to concur or endorse Newcastle's overture. But then came COVID, and the Baltimore Assembly was canceled. Fast forward then to the hybrid 225th General Assembly held in Louisville and online in June and July last year. Greg and I edited his original statement to Presbytery down to 5 minutes. And then he, with Nicole's help, made a video and virtually submitted the Presbytery's Gaza overture to a newly formed International Engagement Committee in June. Others spoke in favor and asked questions in person and virtually. The committee then voted 31-0 to approve it and sent it on to the July General Assembly plenary session for consideration. The final vote there was anticlimactic because most of the time and attention was focused on the more controversial apartheid overture, which passed 70% to 30%. Our Gaza overture was then combined with the 2 other Israel-Palestine overtures, one having to do with Jerusalem for 3 faiths, and the other adding Nakba Day to the church calendar. In a continuing resolution, that was passed unanimously. Thus, Westminster's overture is now the stated position of the PCUSA in regard to the October 23rd attacks by Hamas on Israel and Israel's ongoing siege and attacks on Gaza.
Thank you, Bob. For those non-Presbyterians in the group, when Bob was talking about PCUSA, that was the Presbyterian Church of the United States, so the whole denomination. I also want to make one clarification. So when the credits roll at the end of the program, that we get the videographer correct. It wasn't Nicole who taped me. It was my bride, Camilla. J Street, some of you know about J Street. J Street is a moderate to left-leaning Jewish lobbying group that advocates for settling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict peacefully and diplomatically. It urges a 2-state solution. Many supporters of Israel think the group goes too far in advocating for Palestinian rights. Many supporters of the Palestinians believe it doesn't go far enough because it opposes BDS. Many of you probably know what BDS is, stands for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. Boycotts involve withdrawing support from Israeli companies that are engaged in the violation of Palestinian human rights. It also involves boycotting entertainment and sporting events in Israel. You've probably heard on the news at some point, some big name entertainer who was urged to boycott a concert in Tel Aviv, for instance, something like that. Divestment campaigns urge banks and pension funds to withdraw investments from the state of Israel and from Israeli international companies. Sanctions campaigns pressure governments to ban business with Israeli settlements, end military trade, and suspend Israel's membership in international forums such as the United Nations and FIFA, the International European Football Association, what we Americans call soccer. The objectives of these is to pressure Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories, to remove the separation barrier, the wall that is around the West Bank, and third, to give full equality to Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. In 2004, the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel's separation barrier was illegal. It said that Israel needed to dismantle it as soon as possible. The International Court of Justice said that reparations needed to be given to those who had been harmed by it. Said that every signatory of the Fourth Geneva Convention, meaning basically almost every country in the world, was under obligation to ensure that Israel complied with international humanitarian law. Israel ignored the ruling, and the international community has made no attempt to enforce it. So in 2005, on the one-year anniversary of that decision by the court, that's when the BDS movement was launched. It was launched to be a nonviolent way of pressuring Israel to do some of the things that the international community believed are necessary. Israel sees the international boycott campaign as a threat to the Jewish state. Palestinians regard it as a nonviolent way to pressure the state of Israel to respect the human rights of Palestinians. Many people have made the comparisons to what happened in South Africa with the apartheid movement there, and how the boycotts and sanctions were able to put pressures on governments, on the South African government, and were able to change a policy without tremendous bloodshed. In my sermon from this past Sunday, I preached on the passage that comes up in the gospel lectionary. It's recommended, and the passage happened to be the one where Jesus said we are to love God with our entire being and then to love our neighbors as ourselves. At the core of what it means to be a follower of Jesus is to give ourselves to a way of life that's based on love of God and love of neighbor. Even more demanding, on another occasion, Jesus said, not love your neighbors, but love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Israel, like every country, has the obligation to defeat terrorists and to defend its citizens against attack in accordance with international law. Hamas militants must be brought to justice for their despicable and inhumane crimes, and all hostages need to be released. On the other side, as the Israeli Defense Forces seek to destroy Hamas, we know they're killing thousands of innocent citizens, most of whom are Christians and Muslims who have no love for Hamas. Some Israeli leaders have called for, quote, bombing without distinction and, quote, destruction rather than accuracy. And what I find very chilling is the Israeli defense minister said, we are fighting human animals. Fury and revenge fuel conflict and killing. And they set off this deadly cycle of retribution that just has no endpoint. To right a wrong, an eye for an eye can feel very satisfying. But in the long run, it ignites this ever-widening circle of blindness and death. In Israel-Palestine, this cycle has been devouring people for 75 years. It doesn't have to continue. Human beings have the freedom to choose. We can choose differently. We don't have to go to war. We don't have to kill. Focusing on exacting retribution and evening the score is a deadly trap. Leveling Gaza will not quell long-term violence. It will surely intensify hatred, and I'm pretty convinced that it will just create new terrorists. There needs to be a plan for the day after. And the real question is whether that plan is going to be driven by revenge and the delusion that the other side can just be completely eliminated, or it can be driven by a plan that sets down a foundation for basic human rights and peace for both sides and security. Jesus calls on his followers not to respond to evil with evil. I believe that's what's first needed between the Israelis and Palestinians is empathy. They need to understand each other as best they can. They need to understand the suffering of the person on the other side. The vast majority of the Palestinian people want to live in peace. They will accept Israel's right to exist. Palestinians are ordinary people who want a normal life, just like any Israeli does. As we know, crisis can bring opportunity. And as the members of Westminster will tell you, I'm hopelessly optimistic. I'm always believing that God is guiding us toward a better day. And I cling to the hope that the terrible killing that's probably going to get worse before it subsides still can lead us to a better day. I pray that the hundreds of thousands of Israelis that poured into the streets to protest the actions of their prime minister before, just a few months ago, will pour back into the streets again and demand that their government work out a way for Israelis and Palestinians to live together in peace. Many had said the two-state solution was absolutely dead, no chance. But a lot of people are beginning to say, with what's going on now, the two-state solution may be a viable option once more. It may be the only way to justice and peace. I think it's good for us to remember that after World War II, bitter enemies of one another in Europe found a way to forge a path to peace. There's no reason that Israelis and Palestinians can't do the same. They have to get to know each other. They have to build relationships with each other. In the 1980s, few people thought that they would live to see the end of the Cold War. Few thought they would live to see the end of apartheid in South Africa. Few thought they would live to see a united government in Northern Ireland. But in less than one decade, all those conflicts ended. In my Tuesday message this week to Westminster members, I talked about the Peace Drums Project. Back in 2010, some of us, a few Protestant ministers gathered with some Jewish rabbis, and we began talking about our differences over the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And we started talking about the possibility of doing some sort of peace effort jointly in Israel involving children. And Bob Stoddard ran into Harvey Price a few weeks later. And Harvey was the UD percussionist teacher, and he taught steel drum bands. And he had this dream. Harvey's a Jew and been to Israel many times. He had this dream of creating steel drum bands with Jewish, Christian, and Muslim youth. We got together and started meeting. We met for 5 years. We raised money. It was probably good in the beginning that we didn't know that raising money for steel drums was going to cost us $40,000. So we went into it pretty naively, but we raised the money. And then we began sending Harvey over to Israel with the steel drums. And we got these kids from Arab school and a Jewish school who just lived 12 miles from each other in northern Israel, and who didn't know each other, whose parents didn't know each other. And they started playing steel drums together in a band. They would play on their own in their own schools, and then once a week, they'd get together and form their own band. And they started forming friendships. And that forced their parents to get together. And the parents who lived close to each other, who didn't know each other, started getting to know each other. And they started seeing the other in a very different light. After a few years, we were able to bring the first Peace Drum Steel Band here to the United States. They played in front of 700 people at Cab Calloway. They played in Philadelphia in a synagogue. They played in New York in a synagogue. We took them to Washington, D.C. It was a pretty marvelous tour that they did here. In subsequent years, there have been more steel drums bands created as the children get older and start off with younger kids again. Those kids have now played in a variety of countries. They played before the president in Austria. They've played in Germany. They played in the UK. They played in Switzerland. It's really spreading the message that people can work together and learn to become friends with each other. And I really think that one of the chief ways that we will get to peace in Israel-Palestine is when the people demand contact with each other and begin to demand from their governments no more killing. We can't kill our brothers and sisters. We know each other, we're friends, and we've got to find a better way. And I think that's the best opportunity for a long-term solution in Israel-Palestine. Sue?
Thank you so much, Greg. We so appreciate your sharing your experience, your perspective, your wisdom. And we want to open up the discussion, the dialogue, to questions, to comments. I see that Eileen has her non-digital hand up, but I'm going to start with, is it Tom Davis? Is that you, Tom? Is that TC Davis? Okay, Tom has had his hand up for a while. So Tom and then Eileen. If you would unmute yourself, Tom, that would be great.
First of all, thank you very, very much, Greg. And Bob Stoddard, I haven't seen you for quite a while. By the way, I am the commissioned interfaith peacemaker of Newcastle Presbytery as of 2011. And I was ordained in your sanctuary and raised by Westminster Church. So I appreciate what you're doing for this cause. But I bring two concerns to the body tonight. One is the language of terrorism. It's a label that we use, I think, too hastily when we witness such behavior as we've seen recently. I saw it in Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam vet. But I think what human beings do with a my voicemail operator. I think what we do with that word is to distance ourselves from the people that are exhibiting that horrendous behavior in such a way that we dehumanize them. And we also isolate ourselves from the realization that under sufficient pressure, we could do likewise. I experienced this as a combatant in Vietnam. If you grind a person hard enough and make that person angry enough by aggression, that person may very well see himself or herself perpetuating behavior like that. So I think we need to look at that and be careful how we apply that term, terrorist. We'd be better off just saying enemy. And then we could use Jesus's proclamation, we must love our enemies. How do we deal with that? The second concern has to do with the scriptures of the Christian community and the Jewish community. You rightly pointed out, Greg, that anti-Semitism was born in Christianity, and it's right there in our scriptures, in our New Testament. The anti-Semitism, the roots of that. Rosemary Ruther's book, Faith and Fratricide, did a very good job of pointing that out. I believe that likewise the Hebrew scriptures have ample fuel for a spirit that oppresses the Palestinians. There are numerous examples in the Hebrew scriptures of God countenancing the crushing of the people that were in that area. What do you, I want to ask rabbis, like Rabbi Beals, a dear friend locally, what do you guys do with that stuff? What do we do with it? So I think we need to wrestle with our sacred scriptures and see how they may have pushed our ancestors into thinking in ways that weren't positive. So those are my two concerns.
Thank you,
Well
Tom.
taken, both
And
of
Greg,
those, Tom.
yeah,
Especially the comment about the terrorism. Sometimes terrorists are in the eye of the beholder, and getting away from that language is probably a good idea. I like your idea of substituting enemy, and also your point about how sometimes the Canaanites and the Moabites and some of the others were supposedly had God's favor for crushing them. There's some really rough stuff there. Yeah, thank you.
Eileen, you're muted.
Eileen, you're mute.
Apologies, everyone. I'm on traveling, and that was an error. So I'm just going to listen in. Thank you very much.
Eileen, I think I have lost you. I don't see Eileen anymore.
She's on the screen, but she's still muted.
Okay. I can't unmute you, unfortunately.
You should be able to invite her to unmute, which
I
may
have
help.
done that. Should be a button on the lower left of your screen that will do that. Tom, would you like to lower your hand? I assume you're not ready to talk again. All right, Mary Vane, you have your hand up. Eileen, keep working. We'll get to you.
So Greg, can you suggest actions that members of our community could take to support your recommendations?
Well, obviously, it's going to depend a lot on political leaders. And so people really ought to be contacting their representatives in Congress and expressing their opinions. They count the number of emails that come in or the calls that come in. They want to know where the constituents are on issues. So that's part of it. Educating people is also part of it. Supporting aid programs, I think, is critical at times like this. So those are a few of the things that we can do. And also, you know, I'm a big believer in interfaith relationships. I think it's really important for us here, wherever our community is, to get to know people of different faiths and to build friendships.
Thank you, Greg.
Other thoughts? Bob?
I would just add that it's also possible to call and or email the White House as well. So you can call the number at the White House, or you can send an email to whitehouse.gov/contacts, I think it is, comments or contact.
It looks like Eileen is unmuted. We might be able to hear from her now.
Oh, no.
Oops, I shouldn't have said that.
I think you jinxed it, Greg. All right, Dave McBride had his hand up while Eileen works on her obstreperous microphone.
Well, let me start off by saying that Sally and I have talked with Greg and Camilla about.
All right, Dave, hold on just
I'll
a
stop.
second. Oh, no, go ahead. I don't know what's happening with Eileen.
Well, let me say that Sally and I have talked to Greg and Camilla about this subject, and we agree on a lot of things and maybe disagree on a few things. But I wanted to say what we agree on for sure is that I think the events of this last month have demonstrated the bankruptcy of an effort of the current government in Israel to ignore the needs and demands of the Palestinians. I think that there is no solution to this problem at the end of a gun. There's got to be a political solution somewhere along the lines, and the only one that seems to me, perhaps by default, is the two-state solution. And the unfortunate circumstance we are in is both Hamas and the current Israeli government, which I think is going to become a minority and be out of office in the very near future, are opposed to the two-state solution. But I just listened to a program by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And speaking at that program was a Palestinian scholar, teaches both the United States and in Palestinian universities in the West Bank, or has both. He's also probably the leading pollster of Palestinian political attitudes. And he said one thing that gave me encouragement and one thing that caused me to be more pessimistic. The thing he told me that caused me to be more pessimistic was that recent polls of Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank, immediately before the attack on October 7th, indicated that while a minority of Gazans would vote for Hamas or support Hamas, 38% do support Hamas. And the other thing, and even more disturbing, is that as a result of the October 7th attacks, Hamas's popularity has skyrocketed in the West Bank. The optimistic thing he told me is that Israel has no desire to occupy Gaza. That's why they got out in 2005, and they didn't want to go back in. I think it's pretty clear that they're going back in now because they felt like they had no alternative to address the military threat that Hamas is to Israel. But he indicated that because of that, there is no group that could possibly occupy Gaza other than Israel, except for the Palestinian Authority. And his, I don't want to say prediction, but I had never thought of this possibility. His view was that there was an opportunity for the Palestinian Authority to say, well, we'll come in and we'll take over the governance of Gaza, but you, Israel, must commit to the two-state solution, and you must reopen the peace process. You must stop the expansion of settlements on the West Bank. You must stop the destruction of Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem. And while he wasn't optimistic that Israel would be prepared to pay that price right now, he thought that in the not too distant future, that may be the only option available to Israel, other than one it doesn't want, which is to occupy the Gaza long term. And then I guess a last thing I wanted to say, and I will confess, while I absolutely agree with the proposition that dehumanizing either side is the road to failure, and that the only hope is when we can begin to feel understand the story and feel the pain on the other side. To me, Hamas is the definition of terrorism. And I don't believe that what Hamas did was driven out of some oppressed passion on Hamas's part, because they've been undertaking terrorist acts against innocent Israelis since the 1990s. They did it specifically in the late 90s in order to destroy the Oslo peace process, even as Israel was trying to reach a peace with the PLO and Yasser Arafat. They undertook this. In fact, the Palestinian scholar that I was just listening to on the Carnegie Endowment said there is no question that the horrendous terrorist attacks that were done, the beheading of people, the killing of infants, the capturing of innocent people, was all calculated strategy by Hamas. They had given directions and orders to their soldiers to do these things, both because they wanted to strike terror into the heart of the Israelis, but even more significantly, because they wanted Israel to overreact to these attacks and destroy any hope for reconciliation between the two sides. And in fact, I think it's pretty well accepted that what drove Hamas to do this now and to do it in the way, and remember what they did is they not only slaughtered these people, but they live streamed the killing of people on their person's Facebook page so their family members could watch while they killed them. And they did that because they wanted to completely destroy any prospect of reconciliation, because they were concerned that the reconciliation that was occurring between certain Arab nations, particularly Saudi Arabia and Israel, in the Abraham Accords that are being negotiated or were being negotiated, would weaken Hamas. And if we are to understand Hamas's motivations for terrorism, even assuming, and I do agree that the policies of Israel and how they've treated Gazans and how they've treated Palestinians on the West Bank I can't defend it. I don't agree with it. And I think it encourages it provides support for Hamas. It makes Hamas stronger to do those things. I agree with Greg that what Israel is doing is making more terrorists, not fewer. But if we're going to understand what's driving that side, we also need to understand what's driving on the Israeli side and what's happened in Israel. And we didn't go through this history, but there's a great PBS Frontline documentary called Shattered Peace about the Oslo peace process and how it failed. I don't think there's much doubt that the failure of the Oslo peace process, although there was blame on both sides, was mostly a blame on, at least according to Bill Clinton and American negotiators, was mostly Arafat walking away from the peace.
Dave?
Yeah, I know you want me to shut up.
No, I don't want you to shut up, but I want to give a few other people an opportunity to speak, and we do have a time.
All right, well, let me just say this, because this has all been, frankly, a lot of what's been communicated explains the Palestinian view. It doesn't explain the Israeli point of view. After the Oslo peace process collapsed and after Israel withdrew from Gaza, and instead of Gaza becoming a peaceful neighbor, became an armed camp attacking Israel, the Israeli people, and I was there in 06 and 07 and met with a lot of them, including people in the Israel State Department, they gave up on the peace process, I think wrongly, and that despair on their part is partly what drove the Israeli policies in the West Bank. I think those policies are a mistake, but you can't understand, you need to understand both sides of this. All right, I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Dave. And I think Eileen has a microphone. Do you?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Number one, in 1948, bombs came through my husband's cousin's home. And why was that in 48? Because he was Supreme Court Magistrate of Jerusalem. So immediately the invaders came and targeted people of renown. Later on, we contributed so much to the armament that Israel has. In when the West Bank was attacked, we supplied C-5 planes from Dover, packed with armaments for the Israelis. We have contributed so much to the violence that has happened. You cannot say in any terms that Israel is a democracy. It never has been, and it probably never will be a democracy. And I think you have to remember that. On another vent, since I'm a Catholic, we have an Ulster project with 20 Protestants and 20 Americans coming over from Ireland every year to meet with people here and be housed with Americans. So we try to do our part, but we've contributed so much to what is happening and the brainwash in Washington with everyone siding with Israel and sending more bombs. We are part of the genocide that is now happening. At least 183 babies are born every day in Gaza, and the mothers don't have enough formula, they don't have enough water, they don't have enough food to make milk to feed these babies, and we are part of this genocide. I don't know how politicians sleep. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen. Becca, you have had your hand up.
Thank you. And just to be clear, these are my thoughts. These are not, I'm not representing my organization right now. I believe most of the people in this group and myself will always stand with the oppressed. And I think that's the bottom line here. Throughout history, we've been here 2,000 plus years, and we have never called out the wrong people. And I think, getting a little bit political in my sense, Netanyahu is a Trump. And for anyone to stand there and not call him out, if Trump were our president and this was happening, are you kidding me? I'm just going to say thank you so much, by the way, Greg, and you guys for putting this on. And I know it's a very sensitive topic for everyone. So I just really appreciate you guys doing this. Thanks.
Thank you, Becca. Barry? You're muted, Barry.
There you go.
I'm
Can you
going to
hear
get a
me?
wine glass that says you're muted.
Okay. A comment reflecting a little bit on Mary's suggestion earlier about what can we do as individuals. I'm mindful of the fact that I'm the son of a World War II veteran. Many of us know Vietnamese war veterans. My father never taught me to hate Germans or hate the Japanese. If you look at our relationship with Vietnam today, the generation that was coming of age in the 1970s and 80s weren't taught to hate the Vietnamese. I think one thing we can do as individuals is just talk to our own children and our grandchildren about these feelings we have, these opinions we have, the Christian views we have about the conflict. And hopefully in a generation or two, they will be able to influence their leadership, their government to move in the direction we would like them to do. If I may, just real quickly, I'm sitting here thinking about a song we may all remember from Crosby, Stills and Nash, probably back in the 60s. It's entitled Teach Your Children Well. There's one stanza that says, teach your children well. Their father's hell did slowly go by. Feed them, your children, on your dreams. The one they picks, the one you'll be known by. So I feel an obligation at least to talk to my children, my grandchildren, and let them know how I feel about these terrible wars that are going on around the world.
Thank you, Barry. Let me turn it back to Greg and or Bob for some closing words before we end our program this evening.
Well, I feel like I've had a lot of words and we've gone past 8. So all I will say is if people want a little bit more information on my views, you can go to our church's website, the sermon I preached this past Sunday and my Tuesday message that I sent out just a couple of days ago, and then a prayer I prayed a couple of weeks ago. All of those are available. And then I did an interview with Dr. Muqtadar Khan as well. If you're not familiar with the YouTube Conversations, that's spelled Khan, Conversation, you can check those out as well.
Thank you so much, Greg. I will say, if you have the opportunity, you should watch the video of our worship service on Sunday, because I was at worship and watching and listening to Greg's sermon and Sudi's prayer were extraordinarily moving experiences. And you can read printed word, but the experience itself was powerful. So thank you all for being here. Certainly one of the things that we all can do is pray for peace, pray for wisdom in the leaders involved, and do, as Barry said, our very best to communicate our beliefs, our values, our desire that this horrific carnage will end and peace may be found. We invite you to come back next week. Our program will feature a topic closer to home that deals with the criminal justice system in Delaware, and a desire for a program called Compassionate Release. So once again, thank you to all of our regulars for being here. For those of you who have joined us tonight for the first time, we hope you'll come back. So wishing you all a good evening.
Thanks everyone for staying with me.
Good night.
Thank you.